The history of parliamentary sovereignty, the idea of parliament is a very simple one, and it goes way, way back to the very beginnings of parliament in the early Middle Ages, and it's fully developed by the 14th century, that's the 1300s. And the phrase is very simple. It's used, interestingly enough, with a taxpayers' revolt. People saying, why on earth should we pay taxes for things that we know nothing about, and that we've actually had no direct share in endorsing? And the judges reply quite simply, everybody is bound by what is decided in Parliament, because everybody is represented there either in person or by their representative. So it's the medieval theory that what concerns everybody should be decided by everybody. And again, when we think about the Middle Ages, we tend to think of it as a period of natural absolute monarchy and whatever. This is simply not true. The Middle Ages had a very powerful sense of the common good, of corporatism, and of the need to involve people in decisions. And the English Parliament, and it is the English Parliament, is the outstanding model of this process. But it's very important to understand something else. We tend to think of parliamentary sovereignty as something modern, as something towards which we move, that it's a product of progress. In fact, the English Parliament is peculiar not because it's modern or progressive or changed very much. What's peculiar about the English Parliament is that it's very old, very entrenched, and doesn't change. Virtually every other European monarchy, of course, apart from Italy, they were virtually all monarchies. Virtually every other European monarchy had some sort of parliament. They're called estates, generally speaking. The French, the Estates General and the estates of each individual province, or the actual territories, directly ruled territories of the French king. But they disappear. What's peculiar about the English Parliament isn't that it develops, that it simply survives. And we need to ask ourselves why it survives. The parliaments in most European countries in the late 16th and the 17th centuries disappear for the very simple reason they were a nuisance. They simply got in the way of good government. What is remarkable about England is that the Parliament is there to facilitate government and becomes part of government. And again, this really interestingly, this has got fundamental repercussions for modern theories of Parliament. Even intelligent people like Daniel Hannan say the duty of Parliament is to oppose. You will remember the function of Parliament is to oppose. You will remember that was the statement that was used by the Supreme Court to declare that Boris couldn't prorogue Parliament, which was, by the way, we may even talk about this, an absolute constitutional outrage. This is not true. The English Parliament is created, I referred to it as going back to the 12th and let's get this right, to the 13th and the 14th centuries. It's created by two forces. It's created by those who oppose royal authority, that see the purpose of Parliament as very, very much to oppose the power of the king. That's the aspect of it that goes back to Magna Carta, the great settlement of 1215, except, by the way, we haven't time to talk about this, but the Magna Carta that's really important isn't the Magna Carta of 1215, it's the Magna Carta of 1216 and the Magna Carta of 1225, but that's another matter. But the clear idea there of the limitation of royal power, and then that idea is picked up in the next generation by the great the great and the ungreat and the famous and the infamous Simon de Montfort. That's the opposing of royal power. But the man who is most largely responsible for the shaping of Parliament is not Simon de Montfort. It's not the great opponent of royal power. It's the man who is actually responsible for destroying Simon de Montfort, who defeats him in battle, and because, of course, he's regarded as a traitor to the king, has his dead body chopped up in four, as was the usual treatment of a traitor. That is the Lord Edward. We would now say Prince Edward, that's the heir to Henry III, who comes to the throne as undoubtedly the most aggressively intelligent, forceful, absolutist king of the Middle Ages, but it is Edward I, the man who had destroyed, when he was prince, the man who had destroyed Simon de Montfort, who fulfills Parliament. Why does he complete this process? Because it's useful. And it's useful in two fundamental ways. It's useful because, above all, it facilitates the process of collecting taxation. The English are quite unusual that through most of English history, the rich actually tax themselves. In most continental countries, and indeed there's a certain sense in which this is still true in Italy, for example, it's rather bad manners to pay taxes. Only people who can't get out of it do it. The English upper class were prepared to pay tax because they'd agreed to it, because it had been negotiated with them in Parliament. So one of the essential functions of Parliament is to pave the way for efficient universal taxation. And there's another point which again is very uncomfortable to the modern ear. Parliament is the development of Parliament, of freedom and of self-government are very closely associated with war. The kings who were most effective in the development of Parliament, that's to say Edward I and Edward III, they're great warrior kings. Edward I is busy creating an empire within Britain by successfully conquering the Welsh and by coming within a whisker of conquering the Scots. And on his tomb famously appears Malleus Scotorum. And the other great parliamentary king of the Middle Ages, this is the point at which the full modern parliament with a clear commons and a clear lords and a gradation of the peerage, dukes, marquises, earls, viscounts, barons, appears, is Edward III, of course, who is the king of the 100 Years' War and the war in France. So taxation for war is one of the essential features of Parliament, and again of the great glory age of the English Parliament after 1689, in the 18th and the 19th century, when Britain conquers the world with, above all, the British Navy, carried on the back of parliamentary taxation. But it's also, particularly with Edward I, it's law. It's the unique law-making body. So that's the origin of the idea of parliamentary sovereignty. It is representative of the whole realm, and it binds the whole realm. And then there are all sorts of debates later on, because of course you don't actually talk about parliamentary sovereignty. The sovereign is the monarch. It still is. If you actually look at the enacting clause of an Act of Parliament, it's still the sovereign force giving force to the Act of Parliament is the monarch. The clause declares, be it therefore enacted by, I have to remember it's no longer a queen, by the king's most excellent majesty, with the advice and consent of the lords spiritual and temporal and commons in this present parliament assembled that. In other words, the legislative force is the monarch. Is the sovereignty of the monarch. And when we talk about parliamentary sovereignty, we are not talking, and this is such an utterly fundamental misunderstanding, we are not talking about the so-called sovereignty of the House of Commons. We are talking about the crown in Parliament, and it's that complex tripartite body that is represented by the enacting clause, be it therefore enacted by the king with the advice and consent of the Lords Spiritual and Temporal and Commons in this present Parliament assembled that. It's why Westminster, the Palace of Westminster, is still a royal palace. It's why there's a state opening of Parliament. It's why and all of that was designed by Prince Albert, Victoria's consort, who is very much in charge of the committee that is responsible for the rebuilding of the palace in its present Victorian form after the Great Fire of 1834. So it's the whole body incorporating the crown, which is the activator, and it's also, of course, the boundaries of what it could do do change, and the most important of the changes is in my own period of history. It comes with the legislation of Henry VIII, in which everything, including even matters spiritual and of belief, are to be decided by the English Parliament. You know, what is true Christian doctrine is still, although you wouldn't know it from the antics of the current Church of England, its final arbiter is Parliament. And as it were, the final perfection, the honing of the doctrine, is the late 19th century. Is the polish of 19th century constitutional theorists. But the essence of it, and this is the really important thing, is utterly embodied in the English psyche and the English way we've governed ourselves. And remember, that way, as I've tried to argue, is fundamentally historically rooted. It's not part of a developmental process and one of constant improvement. In fact, the English are unique in that they're the only people who've decided that progress was a mistake. We actually reversed a revolution. The revolution, the Puritan revolution of the 1640s and 1650s. And it's reversed without foreign intervention. There is a restoration in France, but it's actually imposed by the other European powers, led by Britain, with the defeat of Napoleon and the reimposition, for a time being, of the Bourbon monarchy. The English decide to do it for themselves. The Constitution, and this is the vital thing, which has been completely forgotten in all modern debates on the Constitution, our Constitution is fundamentally historically rooted. It is not a product of abstract theory, and that's why it lasts. That's why it's so good. And do you know what? It's even true, really, of America. America, okay, has got a written constitution, but it represents the lightest reworking of the tripartite structure of the English Constitution of the 18th century. And finally, all of this is even symbolized architecturally. If you look, well, let's go back to that building we were talking about. Let's go back to the Palace of Westminster itself, as rebuilt in 1834. The brief from 1834, the brief specifically said the building had to be in the Gothic or the Tudor taste. Classical buildings, domes, pillars, whatever, like Rome or Greece, were specifically ruled out because they wanted to make the point that our parliament, our freedom, and our laws are entrenched in medieval English history. They're not a product of the... Again, everybody goes on about the Enlightenment. These are not a product of the Enlightenment. These are not a product of Enlightenment values. They're a product of something much more deeper, much more fundamental, dare I say it, in the soil, in the people. I better leave out the R word. That structure that I've described remained astonishingly unaltered until really, well, processes of alteration, of course, were constant, especially from the earlier 19th century. I referred to the burning down of the Palace of Westminster in 1834. That followed 2 years after the first of the great Reform Acts. Now, again, it's really important we understand this. MPs, the members of the lower house, the House of Commons, were always voted for. They were always returned by some form of election. But those who could vote varied immensely from area to area and were always a tiny minority of the population. They were quite substantial one. I mean, the test in most county seats was only people who held 40 shillings worth, that's £2 worth of a year of land. I mean, even then it was a pretty modest figure. So you have many constituencies with quite large electorates. But what is very striking was everywhere else in Europe in the 19th century, there is a process for, we can call it loosely, democratization. Everywhere else in Europe, that process of democratization involves the more or less violent destruction of existing institutions, which is why virtually, I better I'm not a 19th century historian. Let's use that useful word. Most 19th century European states have revolutions, and several of them, like France, France is always having a revolution, have more than one. Britain doesn't. England doesn't. By this point, it is Britain. You've got created from 1707 the United Kingdom of England and Scotland, with Ireland doing a kind of strange waltz in and out, depending on which period you're looking at. But what happens in England is something completely different. The move for the broadening of the franchise, for the incorporation of new political classes, first the commercial classes and professionals, and then the working class, the skilled worker, and then even women at the beginning of the 20th century. And that takes place in England, not as a clamour to destroy existing institutions, but to become part of it. In other words, it's not a clamour for revolution, it's a clamour for parliamentary reform. And this again entrenches the point that I was making before about the extraordinary hold that these things have on particularly the English imagination. They knew Parliament was the right way of doing things in principle. They just felt that it wasn't broadly representative enough in practice. In other words, that phrase that goes back to the 14th century judges, everybody's represented in person in Parliament, either in person or by their representative, it needed tweaking, it needed bringing up to date, which is exactly what happens. And it's really important we remember this. The fundamental basis of English freedom is the idea of representative government. It is not democracy. We only become a full democracy, that's to say that every adult has the vote, after the First World War. So the democratic experiment in England is barely 100 years old. And I think most of us admit it's looking pretty frail. The thing that has actually, as it were, kept us going is this much broader sense of, forgive me, representative government. So the thing that is the root of our freedom is not democracy. It is this idea of representative government, that government should be answerable, and that there should be fixed property rights and a fixed rule of law. And these things antedate any notion of democracy by hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. It's really important. So government then changes first because it's made Parliament, the House of Commons, is made much more broadly representative, right? Simple as that. It also changes territorially from the beginning of the 18th century when Scotland is incorporated. Remember, union between England and Scotland of the early 17th century is a purely parliamentary union. It's really important we understand this. There's a great deal of nonsense purveyed by Scottish nationalists and whatever, but it's some sort of act of English colonisation. This is the absolute reverse of the truth. If you look at the Act of Union, you first of all got to look at why some of the Scots, particularly the rich and the powerful in Scotland, are so keen on it. They're so keen on it because Scotland was bankrupt. Scotland had tried to imitate England and create an overseas empire. The Darien scheme in the Isthmus of Panama and all the rest of it, it had failed horribly and bankrupted Scotland. So Scotland is a tiny bankrupt country, probably 500,000. Tiny. I mean, England isn't very much. Remember, this is early 18th century England itself is probably only 6 million. I mean, it's very, very small. The enormous multiplication of our population only takes place after 1800. That's the moment at which we breach the 10 million mark because of industrialization and the need for industrial labor. And you suddenly alter the rules of ownership of housing and so on, which have been used quite deliberately to suppress population growth. You alter it to multiply population growth, which is why you get the great sprawls of the towns and the slums of Victorian England to accommodate the vastly increased population that's needed for early stage industrialization. But Scotland then, going back to, it is a bankrupt country, and it's above all, it's desperate for two things. It's desperate for access to the English Empire, this already huge trading empire that's built on the back of the English Navy, which is paid for by parliamentary taxes. It's also the Scottish ruling. Remember, Scotland is a country bitterly divided territorially between the north and the south, between the Highlands and the Lowlands, with the Highlands on the whole being Roman Catholic and the Lowlands being a radical form of Protestantism, Calvinism, Presbyterianism, and the ruling elements are in the south, are in the Lowlands, and they want protection against the threat of a Catholicizing monarchy and so on. So England is able to do that. The English want it because they want to close their back door. Scotland has always been the back door for invaders, and the English, of course, engaged in a vast war with Louis XIV, and there'd been traditional friendship between England and between Scotland and France, known as the Old Alliance, to keep the English under control, going back to the days of Edward I and Edward III and the 100 Years' War and all of that. But when union is negotiated, it is negotiated. When union is negotiated in 1707, Scotland preserves everything, apart from its independent monarchy, which had already gone with the Union of Crowns in 1603, after Elizabeth I dies without a direct heir, and James VI of Scotland becomes also James I of England. So there was already a Union of Crowns, but you bring about a union of parliaments. The Scottish Parliament is suppressed, and instead Scotland is deliberately overrepresented on fiscal basis. I mean, they do all the calculations based on the relative wealth of England and Scotland, and they deliberately decide to overweight Scottish representation in the English Parliament. Otherwise, Scotland preserves all the lineaments of an independent monarchy. You have a separate system of law. You have a separate system of education. You have a separate system of a separate ecclesiastical system. The monarch actually changes religion when they go north. The monarch becomes Presbyterian. It's an extraordinary story. The position, for example, of the Scottish universities is the 5 historic Scottish universities is actually written into the Act of Union. There's a wonderful story told of Margaret Thatcher beginning an early anti-universities campaign, and the university she wished to make an example of was the University of Aberdeen, one of the entrenched universities in Scotland, which was going through a very bad patch at the time. My friend Conrad Russell, that's the Earl Russell, Professor the Earl Russell, Bertrand Russell's youngest son, was a wonderfully eccentric liberal peer, and he rose in the House of Lords, and of course you can't actually refer to the House of Commons, you couldn't in those days, you have to refer to it as the other place. Did the right honourable lady on the place realise that he gathered that there was a proposal to abolish the University of Aberdeen? Did the right honourable lady in the other place realise that in order to abolish the University of Aberdeen, she would first have to carry out a little technical measure and repeal the Act of Union, which immediately squashed that notion. So Scotland then, it is very remarkable. It is purely a parliamentary union, which of course is why devolution, which unpicks that parliamentary union, is such a catastrophe. The only theoretical grounds, remember, there was never, and it's really important we understand this, the English Parliament was the representative assembly of a nation. The extraordinary tension that's created with the Act of Parliament is that in 1707, because of preserving the absolute separateness of Scotland and never making any serious attempt at creating the idea of Britishness, it was slightly toyed with, particularly by Scots, interestingly enough. The sort of Scot who wanted to make a great success of himself in England was very keen on the idea of Britain. The English were very, very much opposed to it, and things like the North Britain are satirical. By the way, there was an attempt at calling Scotland North Britain. If you actually think of a play, The Importance of Being Earnest, I remember this vividly because I actually played John Worthington. John Worthington, like all respectable Victorian Victorian gentleman, had 3 addresses. He had one in Belgravia, he had another one somewhere in the home counties, and then he also had the Sporran, Fifeshire, North Britain, and that's this is the middle of the 1890s. But there's no attempt. Nobody ever talks about Britons except in rural Britannia. People talk of themselves as English or Scots or Welsh or Irish. Britishness is for export. It's what you are abroad, which means there is this great paradox. The mother of parliaments is not the representative assembly of a single nation. There is not a British nation. I confronted this. I mean, people like Gordon Brown have tried to invent one, usually by trying to suppress England, but that's another matter. I confronted this back in the late 90s, the early 2000s, when Starmer was making his history of Britain, which is fundamentally factitious. There isn't a history of Britain. Up to 1707, England and Scotland have radically different histories. Ireland always remains different. Rural Wales remains different. We were, always have been, multinational. And the creation of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland was from the beginning unspokenly, and then increasingly spokenly, a multinational state. In other words, there's something very extraordinary about this. The world's most successful nation state, which Great Britain was, it conquers the world, for heaven's sake, with the British Empire, was not a nation. There's a real paradox. And much of what's going on, much of what's happening with the New Labour experiment is precisely the result of that fact. If you look in France, if you look in Germany, if you look in Italy, there were vastly greater differences of language than there are between England and Scotland, or even England and the northeast, southeast and Geordie, or the northwest Lancashire, where my family comes from. But in all of those countries, you have, and particularly successful in France, you have a driving campaign of unification through education, as you do in America, using compulsory state education to impose a single culture, a single language, a single way of speaking the language, and so on. That is never done in England. There is never uniform state control of education. Education is built up from a series of charitable groups, of ecclesiastical groups, rival churches. It allows for Catholic schools, it allows for Jewish schools, it allows for Church of England schools. So it's an extraordinary kaleidoscope, a patchwork of different things, and it's never used to impose a single uniform vision. So all of that, and then all of that is really to the background of 2 fundamental sets of changes. One of them is the great change. Well, there are let's get the changes in sequence. There are 3 sets of changes. The first is the effective elimination of the monarch as the dominant political force, and this, as it were, the altered balance between Crown and Parliament is the great achievement of the Glorious Revolution of 1689. Remember, there are 3 revolutionary settlements of the 17th century. There's the destruction of the monarchy, which follows the execution and the declaration of a republic, which follows the execution of Charles I in 1649. There is the restoration of a pretty well untrammeled monarchy, not completely, in 1660. And then there is this creation of a parliamentary monarchy, which is what it is, in 1689, in which that's something, it's very important we understand this. There is never a theoretical loss of royal sovereignty, but what you get instead is the creation of a remarkable office, and it's one that we talk about far too little when we discuss our constitution, and it's the office of Prime Minister, which in its full sense is unique to England, to the British Constitution. And the Prime Minister has got a double function. He manages the King on behalf of Parliament. So he, because he commands a majority in the House of Commons, he is able to, as it were, finally say to the king, you must do what the majority in the House of Commons wants. That's fine. But how do you control a majority in the House of Commons? 600 people, say a majority of whatever it will be, at least 320, 330 people. How do you control 330 arrogant, often pig-ignorant politicians and politicianesses? How do you keep them under control? Well, you need the instruments of power and patronage and place. That's supplied by the Crown. So the Prime Minister also paradoxically controls Parliament on behalf of the Crown. It's Janus-like. It's this double role, and it's very characteristic if you actually look at Downing Street. Downing Street faces in two directions, one facade, the relatively modest townhouse, the number 10 Downing Street, faces towards the Palace of Westminster. The real Downing Street, which is a most elegant, grand early 18th century house, overlooks St James's Park towards originally Whitehall and Buckingham Palace. It's this Janus face, royal and parliamentary. And that's what keeps the thing, that's what keeps that parliamentary monarchy in balance. And then the next great change is the one that is between 1910 and, is it 1946? I always thought, does the Parliament Act come in earlier? The Second Parliament Act. They're the Parliament Acts which alter the balance between the House of Lords and the House of Commons. The House of Commons, again going way, way back into the Middle Ages, had prime power over money bills. Nevertheless, the two houses had effectively equal power. The house that was the representative house, the Commons, and the house in which the powerful, the landowners, be they the bishops, remember the bishops are there because they too are great landowners, or the great landowners of the aristocracy, they had equal powers. What the Parliament Acts of 1910 and what was it? I can never remember whether it's 45 or 46. What those two Parliament Acts do, they reduce the House of Lords. They take the power away, the power of the House of Lords to veto bills and even largely reduce its right to delay bills. So they lead to this, they turn it from, right, if you like, if we go back into the Middle Ages, Parliament consists of three bodies, each of which has quasi-sovereignty. The Crown, the House of Lords, the House of Commons. What progressively happens is that the independent power slowly trickles back simply into the House of Commons. The others remain immense authority. They retain, in the case of the monarchy, the prestige. In the case of the House of Lords, prestige and the ability to delay legislation and, above all, to amend legislation. But the final power, that final push, which is why people do occasionally refer to ignorantly the sovereignty of the House of Commons. So that is the next great change. So you alter the scope of the monarchy, of Parliament territorially to include Scotland and then Ireland. Then you alter the balance of power within Parliament. But the greatest set of changes are the changes which are brought about without any form of serious consideration, arbitrarily and casually by the Labour government, by Blair's government from 97 to 2010. And it's impossible to exaggerate the scope of those changes or the danger of those changes. Because what those changes do for the first time in English history, to put it quite simply and quite bluntly, they reduce the power of Parliament. Before that point, Parliament, what the doctrine of parliamentary sovereignty means is Parliament is all powerful. There is no higher source of law. And that was true right through English history. There is the great argument, of course, about notions like natural law or the limitation of the law of the church and whatever. That goes completely by the reign of Henry VIII. Parliament is all powerful. The idea of parliamentary sovereignty states quite simply, and this again has got a nicely modern edge to it, if Parliament legislates, if you pass a statute which declares that men are women and women are men, then in English law they are. That is the nature of English law. In other words, Parliament is the ultimate body. There is no body beyond it. There is no notion of a larger body of law to which parliamentary statute must conform. That is what it actually amounts to. What the Blair government does is to slash away that notion in the most radical fashion. It's really important to understand the changes of the Blair government don't come out of nowhere. Changes on that scale don't. And again, I think you can approach it in different ways. I will be inclined to go back to the thing that everybody gets very excited about now, RUBIS, the rules-based international system. That's to say, the settlement of 1945. The settlement of 1945, I think, is the origin of most of what's gone wrong. Now, I know this again is very unfashionable to say. The general view is, the settlement of the treaties of Versailles was, in other words, the First World War and the League of Nations was terrible. And what happens in 1945, the Nuremberg trials, the setting up of the United Nations, International Declaration of Universal Human Rights was a good thing. I think it's proved to be, if anything, even more catastrophic than the settlement of Versailles. Let me try to explain. It goes back to, we've talked a little bit about America and the extraordinary, the world's only successful revolution, the constitutional settlement in the United States. Now, you can approach the American constitutional settlement and indeed the whole nature of the American Revolution in two completely different ways. If you actually look at the Constitution itself and even the Bill of Rights, what strikes you is how unbelievably unadventurous they are. That what they do is, as I said, you get a very, very lightly edited version of the English Constitution of the 18th century, and with only one really fundamental change. Obviously, you introduce elements of election, but remember, they are profoundly aware. This is something, traditionally we think of America as the great triumph of democracy. The founding fathers knew democracy was the most risky form of government. They are absolutely aware of this because what the 18th century had done, the work of the French abbé, they'd accumulated lengthy studies of all the different forms of government, the classical ones, monarchy, aristocracy, democracy, and all the rest of it. And so they knew about the attempts at creating democracies, in particularly Italian city-states, the ancient Greek world. They know all about that stuff. They know how fragile democracy is. And what they do, of course, and we forget this, they build a whole series of barriers in the American Constitution to simple democracy. The original idea was that the Electoral College, which nominates the president. Remember, the original idea was that it would actually debate, that the states would have elected delegates to this thing, and they would debate. It never actually happened, but it was intended to be a process of secondary election. And then again, and I think it only happens in the course of the First World War, with another constitutional amendment. The original Senate was not result of election. It was the two representatives were nominated by each state legislature. So it was designed to be a series of highly indirect forms of election. Okay, but but again, even putting that in, yes, there is a much stronger democratic element than there was in the English Constitution. There was also something else that was completely foreign to the English Constitution, which was the idea of separation of powers. Now, this idea of separation of powers, which comes from the work of, he's always called great, I think he's a terrible thinker, Montesquieu. Montesquieu's work introduces this preposterous idea of the separation of powers. He spends a bit of time in England. He speaks no English. He spends all his time mingling with a group of high radical francophone noblemen, led particularly by Viscount Bolingbroke. And the idea of the separation of powers is a heresy. In other words, the idea that you shouldn't have a combination of judicial, of legislative, and of executive authority in the same body. Of course, Parliament is the fusion of all of those three things. I mean, how could you have a separation of powers in England when the chief of the executive, I mean, remember, there are two monarchs in England. In theory, the monarch is the executive, but the real executive is the secondary monarch, the equivalent of the Japanese shogun, the prime minister. But he sits in Parliament. He sits usually in the House of Commons. He depends for his power on command, in other words, in the legislative. His power depends on controlling the legislative. The only reason that the English Parliament survived was that there was no separation of powers. And of course, finally, it also was the supreme judicial authority because it is the final determinant of law. All of that. But the American Constitution introduces this very dangerous notion of the separation of powers, which is one of the reasons that American government functioned generally so very, very badly, which it did for a large period. And the way, as it were, that you've stopped it functioning badly is by effectively turning it into a quasi-monarchy, which you've done by the enormous multiplication of the power of the federal government, in particularly the post-Roosevelt period, but again also the first Roosevelt, Teddy, in the period of the First World War. But the American, but okay, if you look at all of that, if you actually look at the Constitution, you look at the Bill of Rights, you are in most ways struck by how conservative they are. On the other hand, if you look at the Declaration of Independence, you're struck by how at least radical its opening statement is. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are born free and equal. First of all, it's not a truth and it's not self-evident. In fact, it's the most absolute lie you could possibly think of, for the simple reason, of course, that, I mean, think of how are you born? As the great St. Augustine said, and I will translate accurately, you're born midst piss and shit. You are an absolutely dependent creature. You exercise no independent will of your own apart to bawl for food for about 2.5 years, right? That's what you are. You're a creature of circumstance. So in other words, what you get in the Declaration of Independence, you get a doctrine of an Enlightenment doctrine of fundamental human rights. And it is the great English practical philosopher, criminologist, and whatever, founder of University College, Jeremy Bentham, who describes doctrines of universal human rights accurately. Nonsense on stilts. I mean, if you think about it, how can there be universal human rights? Are there universal human rights now? Where are universal human rights? In China, in Africa, in most of South America, in Southeast Asia, Africa. They do not exist. They're a mere intellectual construct, and I think they are a mistake. But what is very striking is that even though there's this thing called the Bill of Rights in America, the idea of right is very, very little prominent in American politics or jurisprudence until Roosevelt, until the New Deal in the 1930s. And it's at that point that you start to multiply this strange notion of things like the right to work. What? Right to education. In other words, you start to shift from the simple notion of legally entrenched rights like property, freedom of speech, equality under the law, into this extraordinary patchwork of things which seeks to entrench by extra political means what should be the results of the political process. And this is enormously expanded by a simple law of necessity. Why does the Declaration of Independence cite these fanciful, fictional doctrines? It does it because it wants to justify rebellion. It does it because it wants to justify a breach with Britain, with what was in fact an extraordinarily benign colonial regime. It needs to find some external way of doing it. Why does the doctrine of rights take off in the way that it does, and universal rights and doctrines of international law and so on? Why do they take off in the way they do at the end of the Second World War? Because you need, I think, fundamentally to justify the Nuremberg trials. Because you need to justify how Nazi Germany was a constitution, horrible, but it was a constitutionally legitimate state. You have to find some ground, some intellectual ground, by which you can claim that what goes on at Nuremberg is simply not. And of course, some of the Nazis are very intelligent. They immediately point out that this is just the justice of the victors. This is simply what you, because you've won, can do to us because we've lost. And what you try to do instead is to come up with a higher pattern of virtue, a higher pattern, as it were, justifies what's being done. The obvious thing to do is to develop this doctrine of right and some kind of universal natural law, which even the law of sovereign states must supposedly bow before. And this doctrine is then extraordinarily developed through the agencies of the United Nations. And I would also argue it is extraordinarily perverted. And it's really important we understand the perversion of it. All the limitations on freedom of speech, for example, which are adduced by radicals on the left, the whole process of cancellation is grounded in the various is grounded in the convention, the debates that turn the convention, the Universal Convention on Human Rights, into the actual treaty, which in theory makes it binding. Why? If you think about it, if you look at the idea of rights as they were in the original Bill of Rights, as they are in English law, those rights are essentially there to protect the individual against the state. What happens is, particularly under the influence of the Soviets, and remember the damnable thing that happens with the United Nations settlement of 45 is the veto that's given to the Soviet Union, and then later on, of course, to China when it too becomes communist, and this perverts the entire system. And what the communist states do from a very early point is to recognize that you can actually invert the doctrine of rights. You can invert the doctrine of human rights, and you can and you do it in the cleverest way. You do it by claiming to protect minorities. You say that the essential purpose of rights is to protect minorities against majorities, which again, of course, fits in beautifully with the narrative of the wickedness of I don't deny it, the hideous wickedness of the Nazi state, the treatment of the Jews and so on. And what you do is you turn this into but then, of course, how do you protect, in practice, the rights of minorities against majorities? You do it by broadening the power of the state. And the whole way, and there's a remarkable series of articles in a book by a man called, who extraordinarily is Danish, has written this remarkable book showing how the Soviets and their Soviet satellites pervert the processes of the United Nations committees, which wonderfully record their debates in the most minute detail, so you can actually see it, and you can see how this argument that freedom of speech must be limited to protect minority rights, the whole business of hate speech and whatever, is all invented by the operations of the Soviets and their satellites in the 60s and the 70s. It's completely extraordinary. But it's true. What happens then is that this doctrine, this idea of right, then becomes very much part of the the settlement, the 45 settlement. And of course, I've been talking about it now at the level of the international level, of the world level, of the United Nations, of the Universal Declaration. But of course, what you get at the same time is the European version of it, which is the European Convention on Human Rights, written, as we are constantly told, by an English Attorney General. But of course, you've got to remember what it is intended to be. It was never intended to be a body of law. Ever intended to be a body of law. It was a kind of shopping list of what states shouldn't and shouldn't do. I mean, if you actually look at the whole business of freedom of speech, you can see what exactly the problem is. It said that there should be, in principle, freedom of speech, but it should be subject to considerations of public decency, public order, public health, whatever. In other words, if you turn that, and which is perfectly reasonable if you're dealing with states, in other words, the former states that had been under the heel of Nazi Germany, Germany itself. If you're dealing with states which had had no such tradition, this is a sensible way of going about constructing a body of law on freedom of speech. But of course, if it becomes a law in itself, because it's so complex, because there are so many exceptions, because there are so many conditions, it effectively becomes a coach and horse for a judge or a court to impose its own views in very, very sharp contradistinction to the tradition of English law, which was one that was as explicit and precise and as limited as possible, and therefore limited judicial discretion. So I think what we've got to explain then about what happens in Britain with the election of Tony Blair in 1997 is how again, you really do sound awfully Faragiste or whatever, how these essentially foreign and un-English notions about government get superimposed onto our existing structure, or rather you have to chip away at whole sections of the historic core to accommodate them. And wherever you look, you see this process at work. And it's I mean, let's just pick some examples. The central to it, it seems to me, is the attack on the very nature of Parliament itself. That's to say, you cut Parliament's powers in a whole series of different directions. You do it, first of all, by an attack on, I suppose, really, the core idea of parliamentary sovereignty. I think the fundamental enterprise of the Blair government, curiously, Blair represents, in one sense, the triumph of the political process. Extraordinary general election victory, unique capacity at winning elections and so on. But for reasons that I've never fully understood, he is, or maybe because he knew he shouldn't have done it, he is profoundly mistrustful of the political process and seeks in every way to limit it. And let's look at how it's done. And again, it was done in some ways. I mean, what's most striking about those new Labour changes? They're rather chaotic. They're not introduced as part of a single package, and yet overall they have these remarkable consequences. I think the most interesting set of changes, I mean, Blair is a lawyer, is in highly specific legal ways. Let's look at what they did. One that most people, I think, really didn't register what its effect was going to be was the destruction of the position of Lord Chancellor. Derry Irving had been Blair's own mentor. He was actually compared for his power, his lavishness, his refurbishment of the Lord Chancellor's lodgings in the Palace of Westminster. He was compared with, which were refurbished in the most lavish and ostentatious scale. He was compared to the previous holder of the office, to Cardinal Wolsey. And Blair clearly came to resent his mentoring and his heavy hand. And he turned to another one of his friends, to Charlie Faulkner, who was a mere solicitor. And they decided that the office of Lord Chancellor had to be abolished. It had to be abolished, well, first of all, because they wanted to get rid of the Lord Chancellor and his power, but more importantly, they decided that it would be done on reasons of principle, because it offended against the separation of powers. The idea was that the Lord Chancellor in those days was the head of the judicial system. He was also a judge himself, and he sat in the cabinet. So he is a living challenge to the very idea of the separation of powers. He has judicial, and by the way, he was in charge of the process of judicial appointments. He had judicial authority, he had legislative authority, and he had executive and political authority because he sat in the cabinet. So instead, the first intention is to abolish the office completely, and instead to have that faintly sinister thing called a Minister of Justice, what European governments had, whose record, of course, in delivering justice had on the whole been very much less distinguished than that of this allegedly perverted office in Britain. So the original intention was to abolish it. You then discover, of course, that you can't. For the very simple, and this shows the astonishing ignorance, the astonishing historical ignorance of people like Faulkner and Blair, because the office of Lord Chancellor is mentioned in literally hundreds, if not thousands, of statutes. It is, in terms of the historic parliamentary constitution, it's the point. It's the point, along with the monarchy, in which all the different streams of the English constitution actually met. So abolishing the office, well, you couldn't, you demoted, and what had been this office invariably held by a great and distinguished lawyer now becomes the kind of thing which, to show the measure of its fall, is briefly held by Liz Truss. So you can tell how far the office of Lord Chancellor has fallen. It becomes a mere kind of honorific to be attached to the so-called Ministry of Justice. Now, why does this matter? Have you ever noticed, have we all noticed, the appalling mess of our judicial system? Its underfunding, the chaos of the courts, the appalling record of in many ways of the judiciary, but the whole complex of the judicial system, their interaction between, again, another invention, the Crown Prosecution Service, the courts, the prisons, the police, and so on. This seems to me to have been unthinkable in the days of a Derry Irving on the Labour side, or somebody like a Mackay of Clashfern under Thatcher. What we did by deliberately destroying a post of unique authority, we diminished, and I would argue undercut, possibly fatally, what must be one of the central functions of government, which is justice. You see, it seems to me, once again, we've lost sight of what government really is about. If you look at the definition of a king in the Middle Ages, lo, to fight and to judge, that is the task of a king. If you look at the Great Seal, which is the embodiment of the monarchy, on one side you have the monarch as judge, crowned, imperially crowned, enthroned, robed, and whatever. And on the other, you have the monarch as a knight, an armed knight, the defender of his or her people. And those are the two fundamental faces of government: the imposition of justice internally and the defense of your people against a foreign foe. We've completely lost sight of this with the welfare, with what is essentially the welfare state, in which health, education, generally being nice to people, retirement, pensions, and whatever, completely overwhelm the fundamental functions of the state. But you cannot get away without them. If you have uncontrolled immigration, in other words, undefended frontiers on one hand, and on the other hand, an out of control criminal population, you are lost. The fundamental principles of government are no longer being followed. So, I mean, it's going too far to say that is all the responsibility of the abolition or the demotion of the office of Lord Chancellor, but I do not think things could have declined so far and so fast if that had not happened. And then, of course, there was also the other deadly shift, which was the again on grounds that it offended the separation of powers. The Supreme Appellate Court had actually been a committee of the House of Lords, the Judicial Committee of the House of Lords, because Parliament itself was the Supreme Court. You say, no, we can't have that. So you invent a Supreme Court as the final appellate body. But that again destroys the notion of Parliament itself being only one body in the country should be supreme, and that is Parliament, which incorporates the Crown. The position has always been in English law that the judges were under the throne. You know, the famous remark of James I, that they were the lions under the throne. What you do now is you separate, you put alongside the powers of the state, you put the powers of the judiciary, and you actually give them the power to strike down ministerial action and even to challenge legislative action. Now, and it's gone much beyond the sphere of the Supreme Court. That once again, there's been this notion that, in a sense, things are too important to be left to politics. This again, you know, it goes back to these doctrines of natural rights and so on. This idea that some things are so important that they cannot just be left to the natural processes of politics. They must somehow be entrenched. They must be embedded. They must be made that parliaments have to do it. And it seems to me again to be profoundly dangerous. It was only just beginning to be sketched under New Labour, and the origins of it, interestingly enough, do actually go back to Margaret Thatcher. Thatcher, of course, mistrusted the agencies of the state correctly. She looked at how badly nationalised industries had been done, and instead you set up these things called quangos, which are quasi-administrative non-governmental organizations. And the idea is that they would somehow do it better. But of course, they have to be given terms of reference, which are very often embedded in statute. And the problem is that if you, as it were, give them the duty of enforcing what are, as it were, supra-political rights or supra-political values or supra-political goals, you extraordinarily limit the activities of the state itself and of Parliament, and therefore of democracy. Again, just jumping around rather, the decision, which was widely praised at the time, of Gordon Brown to take interest rates out of the hands of the Chancellor, actually it had been for most of the 1990s, it was set extremely happily in a public dialogue between the Governor of the Bank of England and the Chancellor of the Exchequer, and remarkably effectively, it has to be said. But you create instead a monetary policy committee, which is given the absolute right to control fiscal policy. To control monetary policy. This seems to me to be quite extraordinarily dangerous because, of course, it embodies a set of alleged independent experts, and you then create now a structure in which, entrenched in supra-law, is an idea of supra-experts who are above anything as vulgar as having to get either consent or democratic agreement or ordinary political process. And area after area has been treated like this. The Climate Change Committee, again created by Ed Miliband under New Labour, now effectively controls the most important series of decisions on broad economic, social, whatever else you like. The extraordinary process by which we're supposed to get to net zero. Even worse is when what you start to do as part of this process of effectively saying some things are too... I mean, what terrifies me is the whole of what we're looking at now says some things are too important for politics. Now, think about what that means. It means that something, in other words, it's more like divine right monarchy or a church that claims some form of supernatural endorsement. The political process is the one by which we are supposed to weigh, first of all, we contribute to, but the fundamental thing about the political process is it's one in which conflicting goals have to be held against each other. What we are doing is to create a series of single issue committees. So you create the single issue committee that looks after monetary policy. You create another single issue committee that looks after climate change. You create another single issue committee, English nature, which governs land use, which is why you can't build anywhere. But of course, the proper job of government would be to weigh climate change against monetary policy, against land use. But you can't do that because you separated the thing out and you've given each one of these things absolute privileged rights, which Parliament cannot break. And who stops Parliament doing it? Judges and the Supreme Court. And New Labour completely confused the rule of law with the rule of lawyers. And once again, and I'm leaping around now more than I should be doing, but it seems to me that so much of what's gone wrong with our politics, we are now beginning to home in on. We thought, or many of us thought, that it was Brexit. We thought that it was the European Union, which of course represents in excelsis this particular view of politics. It has to, because it's a highly uncomfortable confederation of rival states, and what you tried to do was to create a quasi non-political body, that's to say the European Commission, with another quasi court to enforce its authority. But it's quite clear that the reason that we seemed not to be able to govern ourselves wasn't outside. It wasn't coming from continental Europe. It's internal. It is the final working through of the changes of the New Labour years, which above all set up, above the sovereignty of Parliament, set up the sovereignty of abstract doctrine of one sort or another. And this seems to me to be where we have gone so hideously wrong. We've also, of course, attacked the sovereignty of Parliament in other, even more radically different ways by reversing the processes of the Act of Union. The devolutionary structures that we have created have disintegrated that nation that was unified through its parliament. So we've attacked Parliament in the sense we've reduced the competence of Parliament and parliamentarians, and therefore of us, in terms of the issues of government. But we've also altered literally its geographical scope. All of which, by the way, we saw, all of these points were exemplified in the appalling mismanagement that was COVID, where you got the rival jurisdictions outbidding England in increasingly insanely restrictive policies. And the nature of those insanely restrictive policies was because they were the result of another single issue expert committee, SAGE, in which, there was a rather magnificent description of it. What was it? Mad virologists, out of control statisticians and whatever, a whole series of professional groups that got above themselves, and it contained not a single person who understood finance. Not a single person who cared about education. Not, interestingly enough, a single person who cared about cancer or heart disease, because, of course, it was a single-issue committee. And that single-issue committee also showed something else. The extent to which the theoretical checks on politics have ceased to work completely, because the entire media, the entire mainstream media was not only complicit in this process, but actually clamoured for more and more. It also showed a whole breakdown of the relationship between government and opposition, because the oppositions clamoured for more and more and more. In other words, to summarise quickly what has turned into a rather meandering discourse, I think we are faced with a choice. We need to recognise that we have more than half destroyed what had been the world's most effective system of government. We therefore have a choice. Do we go back and try to restore it? Or do we have to admit that we actually need revolutionary change? My view is that revolutionary change is, and there is very good historical evidence for this, invariably catastrophic. In other words, what we need to do, I rest my case, the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, the Chinese Revolution, all they do is they reinforce the worst aspects of the Ancien regime. What I think we need to do is, as I've been trying to do, but one should do it much more systematically, is to analyse how the old system of English government worked and to try to revivify it and try to do exactly what was done in the 19th century. What Disraeli said is the proper function of a conservative. Disraeli recognises that a conservative in a progressive country, you invariably change. You have to change. You should change. But what you should do is change in accordance with what is there already, exactly as happened in the 19th century when you broadened the franchise within the existing structure of Parliament. What we need to do, I think, and I would actually go back and I would reverse the abolition of the counties as genuine focuses of government. You don't want regions in England. We had historically, and they're still in people's mind, Lancashire, Yorkshire, whatever, the great cities that were carved out of them in the 19th century, the old county boroughs. All of these things were genuine self-governing entities, but they weren't, as it were, in opposition to the state. They were themselves, of course, intimately involved with it, and their representatives invariably form part of the parliamentary process itself. As interestingly enough is the good side of American government, where the American Constitution and the Constitution of the various American states embodied legally very much the old pattern of English government, which is why, I mean, I remember vividly for many years I had a house in America in a tiny little town called Chestertown. Inhabitants, 3,000. There were a reasonably large liberal arts college. That place had its own police force. It had its own fire service, admittedly a volunteer one. It had its own it had its own pretty minimal public sector housing. It ran its own sewage. It ran its own electricity supply. All of that. And do you know what? By a town meeting of all the citizens. And repeatedly in the American pattern, you see that. Which is why, generally speaking, small town government and much state government in America is admirable, if very often large city government isn't. Again, modelled on that old pattern of English government, which I know I sound like the most empty-headed sort of stuffed shirt, whatever. I'm not. But it did work. It worked well. It needs that kind of careful revival and rethinking, which we were able to do with our institutions of government in that extraordinary fraught period of the 17th century. If they could do it at the Restoration and the Glorious Revolution, well, perhaps, who knows, we might even be able to do it now. What it seems to me, again, let's just go back. The principal author of these changes is Gordon Brown. Brown is responsible for the worst features of the old New Labour settlement. In other words, what he's intending to do with the New Labour settlement is to entrench and make irreversible the changes of the 1990s and the early 2000s. In other words, effectively to eradicate our traditions of parliamentary government. That is what it really amounts to. And above all, to lead to... there's something very bizarre about it, because what you do is you multiply political authorities at exactly the moment that politics is failing. you dig yourself. And Gordon Brown was always the kind of man whose reaction to a hole was to dig deeper, dig harder, and to swear when he couldn't dig fast enough. And I'm afraid that the new proposals are simply guaranteed to make our existing mess much, much worse. But you see, if I were you, I would try to broaden what you're doing out. It seems to me that what has gone so lethally wrong with Britain is largely the result of the constitutional changes foisted on the country by New Labour. Now, the Tories, after 13, it will be 14 years, cannot escape blame. They clearly have been shockingly complacent, in many ways complicit in what's happened. The so-called one of the great problems, particularly with Cameron and Osborne, was, you will remember, they admired Blair. Michael Gove was at the centre of this cult. There was the notion that Blair's memoirs were the new Machiavelli, they were the new Prince, they were the new way of how to do government. So far, far indeed from wishing to reverse, they wanted themselves to entrench. And we are now again reaping the rewards of a two-party system that isn't a two-party system, which is really Tweedledum and Tweedledee. And this, of course, destroys any faith in the political process. People are disenchanted by it because manifestly it doesn't do anything. But then repeatedly, it can't do anything. You seek. I mean, look at area after area. Look at HS2. Look at house building. Look at the Channel immigrants. In every case, you see a series of governmental structures fighting themselves. One has only got to look at these to realise that there's a profound malfunction which covers virtually every area of government. What Gordon Brown is doing is proposing to dig down on all of these areas of malfunction. He will simply create more malfunctioning instruments at vastly, vastly greater cost. Why? Why has there been a doubling of the number of highly paid civil servants? Because you're constantly creating new instruments of government. And if you feel that one instrument of government isn't working, you don't reform it, you create another one. So constantly we have bodies with regulators. So you have statutory bodies controlled by statutory regulators. And there's a process of sort of infinite regress. And the thing that it most regresses from is any form of parliamentary control. I mean, really, Parliament on the whole might as well not exist. It is terrifying that the mother of parliaments, the country which pioneered the forms of representative government, well, I suppose maybe it's just like industrialization, isn't it? We were first in and first out. In theory, I am reluctant about referenda. I mean, I was actually very actively involved, along with Matthew Elliott. I'm obviously Matthew in charge of the whole thing, but me making contributory noises in the referendum on the single transferable vote referendum, when there was the idea, very much pushed by the Liberals in the Libcon coalition back in the early teens of the century. I was very active in resisting calls for the replacement of first past the post. I'm no longer sure it was actually the right thing to do. So, but the reason that I would support a referendum is we use the word emergency far too much. We talk about climate emergencies and whatever. I'm afraid I don't believe in those, and I certainly don't think that that kind of, or climate war, this kind of mad panic which those kind of words lead to, helps very much the complex process of attempted decarbonisation. Decarbonisation, by the way, is a fantasy. How do we deal with my wooden chair? But the more material issue is that there is a genuine emergency. There is a constitutional emergency. There is a political emergency. These things are manifestly malfunctioning. The proposals, the new Labour, the renewed Labour, actually it's just old New Labour proposals of Gordon Brown, will make a bad situation even worse. They will destroy what little faith there is in politics and politicians. And can we just be clear what that means? It means that the basis of consent for government goes. Once the basis for government by consent goes, of consent to government goes, the very processes of civil life go. Finally, there is only force. Now, this is something that 800 years of our politics fought to avoid, sought to avoid, constructed institutions that very effectively prevented. What we have done carelessly, unthinkingly, or in the case of Gordon Brown, overthinking and, dare I say, Scottish malice, is destroying something historically rooted in England, and that mattered for the world because it provided a model for the world. So, yes, but with a very heavy heart, yes to a referendum. But who would fight it? Who would argue? Who would... You see, there's nothing to defend. This is what is, or rather, there's a memory to defend. Fundamental to what has gone so terribly wrong, because things have gone terribly wrong with our country in the 21st century, is that you have a Conservative Party that has become merely a name. It's become an empty shell. Some of the problems, of course, in fact, a great many of the problems go back directly to the great saint of modern conservatism, to Margaret Thatcher. There's always been, and the late great Roger Scruton understood this perfectly, the relationship between capitalism and conservatism is a much less simple one than people normally think. The problem with Thatcher was, despite the fact she in most ways was personally a very traditional conservative, she espoused a doctrine of, I suppose Oscar Wilde puts it best, doesn't he? Knowing the price of everything and the value of nothing. That you reduce everything simply to pounds, shillings and pence. Now, it is very important, again, conservatives should have a sense of reality, which is why a conservative government that's presided over quantitative easing should be fundamentally ashamed of itself. The magicking of money from nowhere, and we are now discovering, in fact, you didn't magic the money from nowhere. You actually borrowed it at what are turning out to be spectacularly high rates of interest. But a conservative government is not only about money. It doesn't see everything as measured only in its financial value. And what again I think has gone absolutely radically wrong is finally and this again is something that people find very hard to understand. The political doctrine that is the doctrine of capitalism is not conservatism, it's liberalism. Liberalism is... The liberals of the 19th century were the party of commerce, the party of free trade, of the unlimited growth of the economy. Those, in other words, who believed, along with Mr. Gradgrind, that the only thing that mattered was money. Now, a conservative doesn't think that. They recognize the importance of money, they recognize the importance of property, they recognize the importance of balanced budgets and some sort of relationship between what states spend and what they take in taxation, which, the scale of our government debt is rapidly destroying. But for a conservative, there are values beyond money. Liberalism naturally simply ends in a world in which there is no value beyond the cash nexus. And believe me, it wasn't me who said that. It was Karl Marx. And just let's elaborate that point about, what Marx says about liberalism and capitalism is they are essentially destructive. Because they reduce everything to money, because they reduce everything to how do you make money, nothing is sacred. Marx actually talks about the stripping away of the sacred, the stripping away of the sacred in terms of religion, the stripping away of the sacred in terms of aristocracy. Astonishingly, exactly the same language is used by Edmund Burke about the French Revolution itself. The French Revolution, this stripping, this tearing the veil from leaving man as this man and woman as this naked forked creature merely existing to fulfill immediate desire. That, I'm afraid, is where liberalism ends. And it's a terrifying thought, but the evidence is overwhelmingly true. It seems to me, in other words, that woke isn't this strange aberration in liberalism. It's its natural conclusion. If you look at the insanity of the French Revolution, again, as Burke said, that's where the application of unanchored reason, of reason simply torn away from historical rootedness and historical specificity, that's where it ends up. And I'm afraid the embodiment of all of that is the New Labour enterprise. That is our particular slow burn version of the French Revolution. And you know what? It looks to me that it's been at least as effective.